Much like coniferous bonsai, the broadleaf model, every time we go through the fall leaf drop period of time, we experience a new opportunity to look at our broadleaf deciduous, to see what they've added in terms of their ramification, expansion and enhancement of their shape, of their shape. And this is a pomegranate, a twisted trunk pomegranate, Neji-kan pomegranate, as it's called in Japan, that naturally has far more rotation, a smaller leaf, smaller fruit. It is a dwarf variety of Punica granatum, the Neji-kan, and it twists much more rapidly, much more tightly, and that twist as the tree ages continues to echo through the branches and the other components of the tree. Now, this is a piece that when we started out the process of designing, really had these muscled up veins that connect to roots, that connect directly to branches. And these are very, very tough to cut, to open up a massive wound on the trunk in a region like this where maybe we have a piece of growth or a trunk that doesn't necessarily have the kind of visual quality that we want. And when we look through this, you see quite a bit of movement in the main trunk. You see some great transitions of taper in these sub-trunks and the maturity that's starting to happen on some of those pieces. But this piece right here has always been a bit of a limitation. Now, we sort of accepted this as the front because it put this main trunk front and center. It wasn't obstructed by anything. But again, this progression, when we talk about progression is primary building of your structure, secondary expansion of your scaffolding, tertiary enhancement of your ramification and your refined finest branches, right? And we're in a tertiary stage on this tree, but we still have not reconciled, and we've been waiting to kind of work through the process of design, find a solution. The fact that this tree is still here at Mirai unpurchased, when Neji-kan pomegranates are in such high demand and very coveted in the bonsai world, tells me that we haven't quite nailed the aesthetic of the shape of the tree. And also, you know, when you're in your garden and you're dealing with your trees, if you fall out of love with a tree, that is the tree communicating to you, or at least that is your eye and your sensation or sense of the tree telling you, hey, it's time to take action. When you fall out of love with a tree, that is when you got to go back to work. So progression, definitely progressing through the phases of development, but progression today is also about advancing the aesthetic of this tree and starting to sort of let go of the reins of some of these things that we've used as design guideposts, but we're going to go ahead and start to reconcile. And I think what that means is just exploring a different front. Again, here was the front because of the unobstructed view, fairly lackluster and uninteresting. We have a better base. Notice the base here. Notice the nabari that we get to take advantage of on a structural level here. Notice the movement that you see through that main trunk, but you see how just uninteresting this piece is. And it really is a shame because we've built a beautiful tree up here. We've built a phenomenal tree all the way up here at the very top of it. And you know, that big straight section not really having a tremendous amount of merit, we've avoided making the committed move until we were sure that it was time and we had built some of the other areas of the tree. I think today we've got to go ahead and I think we've got to shorten this because we're seeing a better base, because we're seeing better movement. Let me take you back to the front. Okay, you see the base and the movement there, weak movement, not as stellar. I come to here, base much better, movement of that primary trunk, much, much more interesting. And again, this popping to the foreground, obstructing that piece, really starting to be one of those impediments. Now, there's another progression here, okay? When we start to see, and you have to ask yourself, listen, if bonsai is the recreation of nature in miniature, which I do believe that it is, and you have these trees whose ancient form is not really known outside of the cultivated relationship with human beings. You talk about the olive, the ancient olives, you talk about pomegranate, definitely a Mediterranean cultivated species. One of the aspects of cultivation in these trees is they have this quintessential up and out kind of growth habit, but they start to either through pruning or through their natural sort of broadleaf behavior the weight of the fruit in fruit-producing trees. They come up and out in youth, and then they start to fall on the tips of their branches in these dog legs. And this starts to become one of the really interesting forms that we can explore that kind of walks that line of the quote-unquote wild form. When you're just dealing with domesticated trees, what is the wild form? It's sort of this amalgamation of natural cytokinin-driven informal billow. But this tree looks young. And I want to take it that next step and make it look old. And that's really when we start to get into some of the more interesting aspects of this, okay? So we are going to remark the front here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to put a marker so that we all are able to keep track of what the heck we're doing here. I want to avoid 2 dimensions. And I'm going to go ahead and let me get this big piece out of the way. Now, some of you are going to be asking, could you take a cutting or could we air layer this piece off? We absolutely could air layer this piece off. I'm actually going to utilize this as a very, very large cutting, which pomegranate can take from incredibly large cuttings. We'll put it on the heat bed. We'll put rooting hormone around the base of this. And I have a strong confidence that we will see this take root if we can stabilize this tree inside of a containerized environment. It's a great time to go ahead and do this heading into the winter season where we can utilize that bottom heat to speed up the creation of callus and metabolic activity. And I'm going to be cutting this back to a node here. Now I want this to push again, and when this pushes, this has got to add value to the front of this tree from where we're proposing. So you see, if I cut it too high, I stay very much in the same realm. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to reduce it down here, but I also see this smaller piece that's coming off of it now hierarchically with a shorter, thick trunk needing to change its position. I think that's going to start to become a defining branch of this more aged interpretation of design. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to identify a node here, and I'm going to go ahead and just a nice clean cut. Nice clean cut. Always cutting on the pole, no tissue tear here because we want to patch that. And once we see this piece come off, I'm going to rotate this back towards you. It opens the door for everything. It opens the door for everything. Okay, big, big, big decision there. Again, that's what we lost. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to root that thing, make something really interesting on a shohin level. Neji-kan, pomegranate on a shohin level. I love that. Now, this is leaf drop pruning, which means I don't really need to do much here in terms of treating the wound because that's a more of a developmental cut, right? And so we are going backwards a little bit here. We're going to get shoots to pop. We're going to wire those shoots into position once they mature and become woody and lignified over the course of next year, and we'll come back next fall at leaf drop and give this structural piece its shape. But I do want to be anticipating that sort of action that's going to occur through the utilization of this piece and the changing of this piece's function inside of the tree. Now that that's out of the way, I can go ahead and I can make some determinations here. I want to keep that base off of 2 dimensions. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come back. Whew, super. Oh, there we go. I was right on top of Nabari. That means that there's something even more interesting in there. Okay, and let me go ahead and line this up so that we can see. Okay, taking that and keeping that base off of 2 dimensions. Let me show you that. I've got this big root. Last thing I want to do is face you with that 2-dimensional plane. I take you off of 2 dimensions. This coming to the back, you notice how that maximizes that spacing and the gap there. So when we start to look at this though, I just want to show you the side view of that. There's your front. Notice that that tree is moving away. My front is right here. Apex of the tree is moving away. We're going to have to solve that in 2 different methodologies. First and foremost though, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to elevate this right here just to bring that slightly closer to home. Okay, and you see that enhancing. As long as it's enhancing the line, that's exactly what we want to be very considerate of when we make these kind of decisions, is we've always got to be improving the line on our tree, okay? Now when I look at this and I think about how do I want this apex to be working, I want this apex to be moving towards us here, and I've got a little bit of rotation that's going to come off of that. As long as I can kind of hold and support that, probably going to need a piece of rebar here to go ahead and get that move towards us in the direction that allows us. Now let me just see if I can, yes, I think I actually might have the chutzpah on this lower piece here, yeah, that's gonna work really well. I'm gonna set up right here, and I'm gonna see if we can avoid the utilization of rebar because it is just so incredibly cumbersome, especially when we get into repotting, etc. So let's see if we can get that major piece modified and moved before we go any farther, avoid the use of rebar if we're lucky, and in doing all of that, setting ourselves up for success. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to combine my two pieces up here. I'm going to use a guy wire through the crotch, rubber because it's a soft bark tree, and I'll set myself up down here with a little piece of rubber, tie point, and see if we can't get it done. Let's work through this process one step at a time. Okay, a little bit of paper wrap here on the 6. Now I'm going to be using a 6 on my main continuation of the trunk line, and I have another little bit of a conundrum here. I've got, you know, my lesser of the two thicknesses, thicker piece back here that is shorter, thinner piece here. I'm hoping this over the course of time will overtake this piece in the back and become the predominant line. It's going to have the greater amount of vegetative and photosynthetic capacity. But I've also got these two branches here that are existing in the same vicinity. And this is a great time to start looking at these pieces, recognizing I've got something here that I can work into that space, and starting to understand that I'm committing to this design. I don't want this piece to continue to swell, and we are starting to see some swelling there that is a little bit precarious, okay? So just to get those out of the way, because I am recognizing that if we don't get them out of the way, it's going to be very challenging to go ahead and execute the work, knowing that we're leaving behind a structural flaw that is becoming more flawed, okay? Off we go, and this one's going to be a little bit more painful. Off we go. Now let me show you what that does to the front. Notice that that opens up that space to the right side of our primary line. That's okay because we've got, again, we've got pieces that can move into that. Sometimes opening up this space objectively is exactly what gives us the capacity to execute a design on a higher level. Now I'm going to use my knob cutters and just take these back nice and clean right to the shoulder, okay? Nice and clean right to the shoulder, and I'm just going to patch those with a little bit of putty. Nice clean cut when you start to grab on that shoulder. You leave the shoulder intact. There's not much that we need to do if we have a sharp tool that gives us a clean cut. Our knob cutters are something that we use just for this purpose. We save them. We're very careful with our knob cutters. Concave cutters don't give us that kind of cut. They crush a little bit more than create clean incisions and cut sites. And so I'm going to go ahead and avoid doing anything else. If those need to be cleaned up in the future, no problem. We'll come back with a gouge, but they were relatively sharp to begin with, okay? I'm going to get my paper wrap set up here. You've seen this 1,000,001 times. Okay. Nice tight paper wrap, and I got to think about this now from my guy wire giving me the kind of rotation. I want my guy wire to be pulling this type of rotation, a clockwise rotation, boom, towards me, towards the viewer, rotating the structure so that we start to fill some of this negative space. And that is what determines which side my guy wire wants to enter on. Okay, now I'm going to use this paper wrap structural piece as my anchor point. And I try to emphasize this in terms of guy wire. Typically on broadleaf trees, you don't see a lot of guy wire. A lot of people don't even take the time to thoroughly structurally wire broadleaf trees. But using guy wire, using the same tools that exist in our coniferous model to alter the structure of our tree, the guy wire and the thought processes around guy wire exactly the same. Now we've got a very soft bark tree when we start working with some of our broadleaf deciduous species, which means we may not take advantage, even though the crotch is still a vascularly neutral location, we don't have to worry about necessarily harming the crotch. My paper towel tore. Oh well. Okay, we don't have to necessarily worry about harming that vascularly neutral crotch, meaning it doesn't go across any sort of transport linearly. It just sits right in the middle of that transport. I'm not going to concern myself with a conifer that has thick bark when that piece of wire touches, but where this guy wire comes across that thin bark in our broadleaf model, we want to protect that little bit there. Okay? Now I don't want it to be hideous, still needs to be a nice clean piece of wire. I'm going to go fairly minimal, and I'm going to bridge right where I have that point of contact. Okay? Notice that right there, and it keeps it off of my soft bark. Okay? Now you're going to see here that when I come down to this location, I'm going to use that thicker piece as my tie point so that I don't have to worry about my guy wire slipping because I'm underneath that portion right there. Okay, now I'm just going to go ahead and hold myself into position here. That rotation, keep that wire on that rubber. Thin bark tree, if that wire slips off of that rubber, it can really do a lot of damage. Okay, all right. Not too bad, pretty easy. Let me show you what we did there. Okay, notice that's coming towards us now. It's accentuated the line. Let me now show you the side view here. Now all of a sudden that apex starting to come towards us in this direction. It's not so much to the back now, and we can start to see how some of these pieces are going to play out. Okay, I'm going to come back to that. If we need to tighten it a little more, great. If we're going to call it good there, great. Let's see what happens when we start to get some of these pieces moved to gain some interest. Okay, now when I look at this, each branch has a natural rotation that allows you to move it a significant distance. Okay, now Neji-Kon pomegranate are very, very flexible, and Neji-Kon pomegranate already have a natural twist to all of their tissue, as does any tree, okay? If I try to rotate this clockwise, very, very malleable, very, very gummy, okay? If I try to rotate this counterclockwise, starts to get brittle, starts to feel resistance. That's my natural rotation starting to inform how I have the capacity to alter the position of this branch. And I'm going to go pretty hard with this branch. I'm going to use a piece of 4 gauge. We're going to see if we can truly reposition this piece in dramatic fashion. If it breaks, if it tears, if something happens, we know we're going to get bud push off of that thicker piece, and we know that we have a hierarchy here regardless, okay? So you got to go for it. And when you start to talk about broadleaf trees, this is the time of year where we really see broadleaves having the greatest amount of flexibility, okay? So we're going to paper wrap all the way. 4, 6, 8 will stop at 10. Anything 4, 6, or 8, paper wrap to protect that thin bark. Just going to get myself a little bit of 4 gauge. 4 gauge is going to be necessary to reposition a branch, not super thick branch, but a branch that's been positioned already, that's existed in that position for quite some time. And I want to go ahead and see if I can get it as close as possible to an interesting position. And if for whatever reason we can't make it interesting, then maybe it's a branch that doesn't exist inside of our design. I have a feeling that we're going to be able to create something really unique out of this piece that kind of fits the style. And again, we're trying to age progression in terms of the tiers of building our pomegranate, progression in terms of expanding and enhancing the aesthetic and the appearance of age in the broadleaf form, okay? So I want to get that branch off of that verticality. Doesn't mean that I don't want the tips coming here. I always want the tips coming here on a broadleaf. That's a part of the natural broadleaf growth habit. It's a part of maintaining strength and distribution of strength and broadleaf design. But when we start to talk about that structure can start to add in some more interest. It can add in the up, out, and then down under the weight of the fruit, under the weight of the cantilevered nature of leaf mass over the course of the year. We see broadleaf trees really kind of bow to the physical mass of the leaves as they accumulate. And you say, well, what about phototropism? What about the ability to grow upward? Certainly in youth, phototropism is going to cause the branches to orient upward, and it's always going to be driving the branch tips upward. But in age, with length, and most importantly, with the expansion of branching mass, that is where we do see fruit and we see leaf mass act as a weight that certainly pulls some of our structural branches, or at least our secondary branches coming off of those structurals, down. And that is exactly what we're exploring right here, okay? All right, we're gonna go preformed hook. I've got to have a clockwise rotation, which means I've got to go ahead, clockwise rotation. I'm going to come from underneath here, nice and tight. I've got to be a little bit careful when we start to deal with the paper wrapped model, because I don't want to mar my paper wrapping on my hook. I've got to keep it nice and tight. Just be a little bit careful. Japanese maple certainly can't come crushing through those branches. Pomegranate, a little bit more forgiving, a little bit more flexible, a little bit more forgiving. Always want to be very respectful of the finer branches on any tree. Juniper, pine, broadleaf, etc. Those are the branches that we work so hard to get, also the branches that so effortlessly experience damage. Now watch closely. While I'm at this point, this is where I'm going to first really start to play here and just kind of test the tissue tolerance. Okay, a little bit of rebound. Good. Okay. Really put that stress on the wire, with the wire. And you'll notice that I'm bending it before I've finished wiring, because this allows me to understand how am I going to need to continue to proceed. Now, I want this piece to actually come back up, okay? So that would change the way that I wired it depending on where I wanted that piece to go. I have different points that I need to hit, and I've also got this kind of continual understanding that if I'm not able to hold this position, right? This is kind of trying to get that nice and flexible. If I'm not able to hold this position, I give myself, by only wiring halfway, I give myself the ability to attach with guy wire before I get that really sunk in contact. Okay, now I'm going to come back up. Now I know my stress point's going to be right there at that crotch. I know my last turn of wire has to be right here. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and just give myself a little bit of that. Make sure that stays there. Make sure I'm pulling back to there. Now we start to get some interest kind of a brewing here, okay? I feel really good with that. I don't need to go any more. If I want to make it a little bit more severe as we continue to dial things in, that feels totally fine, but boy, super, super interesting the way that occupies that space. Okay, now, I've got this piece right here. This piece right here, also very straight. Okay, but it flares out, and if I try to bring this in, notice the circular shape I'll create if I try to pull this in. By having this go out, then I maintain some integrity. Now it's too thick to go about trying to bend that piece and add the kind of movement I just did here. That's triple the size of this branch. 4 gauge barely got it done. I don't have the kind of wire to make that happen. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to accept where that's at. Now if you say, well, what if you didn't have the situation where it was tolerable, right? And that is a tolerable position as it exists within the structure of this tree in my mind. Okay, we're still acute out, right? It's not forming the circular because it goes, and then that little line right there is where it's so big. Okay, I've got this piece that's going to be coming out into that section and starting to form that relationship. Bigger space here, smaller space here, different spaces, different heights, different thicknesses, etc., planes, and all of a sudden we have a good multi-trunk form. I'm going to accept that. If I couldn't accept that, if I needed to adjust it, then we go ahead and we roll the dice, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to use a guy wire here, very, very low. We're going to pull to the solid central trunk, rubber pad, collapse that piece, and then we're going to use a block here, and we're going to push, and that's really where we start to create the greatest amount of risk for breakage, is when we pull in and then we push that piece back out, that moment, that's the greatest amount of force because you've pulled this whole thing, you've created this circular shape, and now you've got to break that circular shape. Again, we don't need it on this round. There will be a time in the future where we're probably going to have to go ahead and do that. It happens frequently. That is how you would go ahead and execute that technique should it come to that, okay? I'm going to come back up into here because this feels like a very, very profound piece. I've got great structure. I've got great hierarchy in my ramification happening here. Few pieces in here causing some swelling and some structural flaws. I'm going to go ahead now that we're making some of our more determined decisions and take out some of these pieces just so that I don't continue the swelling. Now this one here, I've got a wound. I've got buds at the shoulder here. As these continue to grow, I should see this continue to form a collar, especially if I decrease that conductivity here. But I don't want to cut this back flush to an already dying back piece. I'm going to go ahead and let that continue to heal. This will push again. But as long as I reduce the photosynthetic mass here, as this area continues to work itself out, it will not continue to swell outward, and that's the priority. So all of a sudden now, I'm not going to be moving this piece. I'm going to be going here to here. 6 gauge should get that done. Let's go ahead and get some paper wrap copper ready for that. Okay. Okay, now this is going to be coming towards me. This is going to have a counterclockwise rotation, which means I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take off this counter piece on the inside, which is going to cause swelling, and that starts to become the landing site for my 6 gauge here. I'm going to hop all the way up onto this. That's a big lunge, but as long as I can get there with that 55, 60 degree angle, that lunge allows me to avoid putting excess wire along the trunk, which I always want to do no matter what species of tree I'm working on. Obviously, the more that you wrap around these central trunks, those are taking in all of the sugars and starches produced by all of the leaves, and those are the areas that tend to scar the easiest on broadleaf work. So the less wire that you have actually constricting that cylinder, the less likely you are to start to form wire scars if you just mistake a little bit of tightening wire. You're thinking it's probably okay, it's just getting a little tight, and then you take it off and you're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that it was actually starting to dig in. That's one of those sort of oh shit moments. Did I ruin my broadleaf tree? The answer is no, not if you just have dents, if you've got wire tracks, if you've take out the wire off and all of a sudden the bark pulls off and you've got exposed tissue. Now you're starting to talk about something that's going to have a much harder time probably healing, and it's probably going to be a bigger part of that tree for a longer period of time. Okay, now I've got to go ahead and support at the shoulder here, and I'm going to pull towards myself, and I'm going to be pulling down at that same kind of rotation. Now you'll hear, when you deal with broadleaf trees, you'll hear the bark start to give, and it gives you just a little bit of kind of sound. I'm getting it on that external area. I'm going to go ahead, and instead of going up, okay, now I'm kind of coming out, and you're saying, well, that's a very horizontal line. Yes, it is, and I push this to the maximum degree. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drop down, okay, and I just want to kind of play with this older iteration, much like I did down lower. I'm going to drop this down first, okay, and then because we're rotating, watch this, I'm going to rotate this piece back up. Okay. And then rotate this piece back up. And I'm going to push this pretty far. Okay. Okay, to get a little bit of interest. Notice now we're starting to get a little bit, it's not so youthful anymore, right? This is kind of a bright young tree, and it's like everything is good. It hasn't really experienced nature going, so how about this, right? How about gale force winds when you're loaded with fruit? Okay, now if I get those splits, I always have to come back. Always have to come back with my liquid. Okay, liquid clogs, touches the tissue. That was very excited. A little burst of callus mate all over the place. Try to keep it as clean as possible. Sometimes it can get a little sloppy. I'll go ahead and come down here and just doctor up some of these points down in here. Anything I need to touch looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. This here, anything I need to touch, let's go right in there. Good, okay. Cool, very cool, very, very cool. Starting to get a little bit more fun. A little more fun, a little more interesting. If we're getting fun and interesting, we're increasing the design. But we have to always continue to keep in mind that we're playing into the growth habit of the tree. So even though we're bringing these down, those tips have to come back up. You've always got to be reorienting everything to accommodate that growth habit and that general natural behavior of the pomegranate. Okay, now we've got another one here. Now this is going to have to swing into the space, and we're looking at the front sort of in that vicinity. This is going to have to swing into this space to be able to efficiently photosynthesize. Now that we're pulling everything towards the front, that space right there exists within this realm where we're no longer under major branches, closes some of that general spacing that exists. This is going to be, let's see here. Yep, going to have to use an 8 gauge. I thought I might be able to get away without paper wrapping it, but just to be able to have total control. And here's the thing, not just control of putting that piece into a position where we're happy with its location, but there's a different concept when you start to reposition branches, and that is the concept of putting it there in a way that maximizes its quality, okay? So it's like one of the things I learned during my apprenticeship is you can know where a branch goes and still not know how to put it there, right? It's like, how do you put it there with an expression of age or an expression of elements that the rest of the composition contextually represents? All of a sudden it's knowing how to put a branch in a location with the appropriate, kanji or style or English, if you will, on it to maximize its ability to exist there in the context of the design, the age, etc., right? So knowing where it goes, you have that general location, and a lot of that general location is given to you by the tree already so incredibly decisive, right? We don't want to try and re-envision locations on the tree that are unnatural to where the branch originates. Where it originates is where it needs to exist in the hierarchical system. Okay, but as we start to change things and we start to reorient things and we start to remove things, sometimes that 25% of the circumference of a tree, when we start to look at where that branch originates, is a fairly substantial amount of space that we have to play in on a tree of this scale and of this size, okay? So even inside of that, I'm just moving this laterally to give myself some degree of quality that empowers us to maximize its ability to contribute to the concept of the aging of this broadleaf form, okay? So I'm going to move this one, put it there in a way where it contributes. I'm going to follow the same general stylistic principles that I've been working through, rotating, using that wire for me to get it into that position, bringing those pieces back up so that we've got that expression here. Okay, but now you're starting to see some of that craggliness, this sort of spilling and falling and then this back up, and giving this tree so much more interest. And some of this, let me just show you what's happening up here. Some of this is going to be a little bit different. If I bring this one down, then I got to bring this one up to maintain that. I don't want to bring everything down. That's not what I'm saying here, because then I get this big, huge dome. I want these small little informal billows. That's what creates the scale in our broadleaf execution of design. So I've got to check myself on a continuum to be making sure that the designs and that the concepts that I'm coming up with are continually abiding by the quality that exists inside of the tree. Okay, another 8 gauge there. Let me just go ahead and get that set. And I've got 2 or 3 more structural pieces, and then we move into the secondary, tertiary phase of this design, or redesign, if you will, and that's when it really starts to get fun and we really start to see things solidified. That last 10% gives us so many of the details that help us understand the vision that we otherwise, have to sort of believe in and exist inside of our head, but we can't see when we initiate the design. And you start to say, what a tremendous tool to have to massage or exercise the muscle of being able to see and understand your primary lines in design when we set the structure first. Okay, I'm not wiring out the whole thing, and a lot of people say, gosh, I have to wire it out and kind of play with it, position it here, position it there, move it around a little bit. I can't see it. The biggest thing that you can train yourself to do is to start to look beyond the initial image of any tree that you're looking at that has merit and whose style you want to take on in the execution of bonsai. Steal some of that technique, steal some of that aesthetic. You're welcome to steal that aesthetic from Mirai. Take anything that you see here that has applicability to any of your trees, steal that aesthetic, own that aesthetic, right? But you've got to be able to see past all of the details. You've got to get past the point where you allow yourself to sit there and play with the branches and try and see what it would look like. Utilize that objective decision making, right? Structural flaws, best possible line as they relate to the trunk, etc. Moving first up and then out on a broadleaf model, down and out on a coniferous model. These things empower us to be able to make a lot of design decisions and a lot of initial structural moves without necessarily having to see it, to physically see it, to understand that it's the correct move. It's objective. This is objective, okay? What's happening now is we're seeing our design concept expand. We came with an idea of what it looks like to age a broadleaf tree, right? Through observation. We see older and older broadleaf trees. I just got back from the Pulian olives, saw the oldest cultivated broadleaf trees on earth. And it's one thing that was part of the Mirai in the Wild project we did with the olives. Very, very obvious that sort of downward movement came from both pruning as well as fruit load over the course of time, and it was a continuum. The dog legs of design were a continuum inside of this sort of fruiting exception to the broadleaf model, where we see that weight contribute greatly, and we see the pruning process contribute greatly. And you say, well, can the pruning process be practiced in bonsai? Yeah, I guess if you wanted to have the same kind of severe cutback that they perform when they're managing the olives to be altering their shape for the fruit load and for the harvestability of that tree. But that probably is going to be a tough ask unless you really understand how that process goes down and what the thought process is. And even inside of that, if you go and you look at all of the groves in Puglia, you will see, 30 different pruning processes depending on who's managing the grove and what their objective is with that grove. And so even inside of trying to duplicate that, there's a lot. And you try to take just a general broad character from the species as a whole. So you look at 2,000 olives, and there are a few sort of continual pieces of information that tend to remain visually true. Those are the ones that I'm trying to steal, right? When I'm talking about this cultivated form, trying to steal the generalities that tend to be true more often than not. Okay. Dropping the kids off a little bit. Okay, I've got a little bit of room here. I might have to reduce a little bit of my width here. Circle back, make a little bit more of a committed gesture. Great. Great. Okay, let me show you that one. Starting to see some interest here. Yes. Gosh, transformation happening very rapidly now. Love it. I love it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to get rid of some of these excess pieces so that we don't have more of these hideous lines occupying our intention than we need to. Good. Okay. All right, let me get rid of these guys. Perfect. Okay, and we've got one more big one right here. Let me show you this, okay? From the front where you're at, look at what this gives us, okay? This gives us something kind of radical, and it gives us something kind of radical because this one has the ability to be, you know, potentially another sub-apice or even raise the height of the tree. Now, that extends above my hierarchy here. Okay, all right, well, we can play with that, right? Branches on a broadleaf can go above the apical region and kind of exist up in here. I would love to see if we can put that branch into action. If we can't, we can always shorten it. We can always reduce it. But if we can, it starts to become a real defining character of the tree. Maybe not defining branch, but definitively a contributing piece of character in the design of the tree. And ultimately, what do we want out of this scope of work? We want this tree to look older. We want this tree to look more craggly. We want this tree to have a greater degree of interest. Okay, I'm going to go 8 gauge again. Yeah, that feels like that's going to get it done. Okay, always the wire that allows you to move any direction that you want your branching to go. Just trying to see if I have another pairing here. I don't really see one, so I'm going to go preform hook. There we go. Okay. And I know that I'm on the, a lot of times people say, how do you know when you're on the right track? Or how do you know when you've like maximized a design? I know that time is always going to give us more. It's going to give us more character. It's going to give us more opportunity. It's going to give us more options, right? The longer that this tree is a bonsai, the better it should get. It's like dog years in a container, right? 1 year is equal to like 10 years of normal existence outside of a container, maybe 20, maybe 50, depending on how hard we're pushing the tree and the age the material possesses the capacity to represent. But ultimately, there's got to be something a little bit more, there's got to be something a little bit more to help you understand if you're on the right track. And when it comes right down to it, if I'm just talking about this is my measuring stick for being on the right track, when I start to look at the tree and I start to see the tree have personality, I see the character of the tree starting to emerge, right? It feels like it has some sort of, identifiably human characteristic. That was the quality of Mr. Kimura's work that I really enjoyed. And the quality and the component that I tended to lean on whenever I saw a piece of work where he had pulled out an almost human characteristic in the tree, that was the one that I wanted to sit and look at the most. Whenever I get that sensation that I can see the tree, I can see its character, I know that I'm starting to tease out that individual quality from the tree. And as I start to look at this, I'm seeing a markedly older pomegranate coming out of this design as we start to play with these different fields. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring this one over. I'm going to keep this one headed up, and I want to play with what happens, and you're sitting right at the front there. Okay, now what happens if we now start to play with this one? Okay, now that's adding some interest. Now I've gotten these lines that are kind of coming through the design in these varying degrees. I've got this one going up. I don't know if this is going to create too much chaos, but I'm going to go ahead and give it a try of bringing this piece down. Notice that I've got a piece that exists on top of it. Oh, okay, split that at the crotch, should be okay. I'm going to drop this one off at school and let that one exist down to fall into that space. And I just want to see what happens there. Okay, so I've got these crossing lines, but that's creating a much more interesting, notice how much more interesting that character is. Look at that. Look at that. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change course just a little bit here. I brought this one up. I'm going to go ahead and bring it up. I'm then going to bring it a little bit more down, and then I'm going to bring it up again to try and get it out of that line so that those two lines don't necessarily intersect. That feels good right there. Okay, all right. There's my structure. Okay, let me give you the once around in terms of my structure, kind of finding that better base, that better line, and look at how that's come together. Just in terms of a structural change. We haven't done anything more than a structural change yet, and that structural shift, I actually still have a little bit of mobility right here. I'm going to bring this out, sort of occupy some of that space there, and we can decide a little bit later on. Actually, I'm going to carry that 6 gauge out another turn, get right to the end of my paper wrap. Okay, maybe that one wants to drop down too, all the way at the top of the tree. Drop down here. See what happens there. Okay. Okay, and I don't want this to get too wide. Kind of like that dropping down a little bit right there. Let me go ahead and give you that. Yeah, that's good. That's good. That feels a little bit more. Now, again, we're trying to see into the future here. We're trying to envision how this all comes together. Let's come back and let's set the tone. I want to patch anything where I saw splits, and I did have that one major split up top here. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to patch this. Some of these splits, you know, as much as we say, you know, in the Japanese model that you don't want dead wood, that you want this kind of perfect transition of taper, that you want this very beautiful, smooth and seamless, scarless trunk, when you see really old broadleaf trees, they are all kinds of tore up. They are all kinds of marred, interesting shapes and forms. And so you have to decide, is the smooth, flawless model the model that you want to abide by, or are we going to do something different? For this one today, we're going to do something different. Okay, so now I get to move away from my paper wrap into the 10, 12, etc. And once I get into this, now I want to be making sure that I have the capacity to give the kind of movement through the different branching combinations. And I'm not trying to wire every single one of these branches. In fact, I don't want to wire any of these finer branches if I can avoid it. Doesn't mean that I'm going to get away with it. Doesn't mean that I'm going to have the ability to organize everything here. But I should be thinking about rotation as rotation pertains to being able to distribute these finer branches in ways that allow me to not have to wire them all, right? Okay, so I'm going to drop some of these down. I'm going to use that rotation. And I want to play on this again, and then I got to bring this back up. Okay, and then I'm going to bring this all the way over. Come on back up, and then back out. Okay. Now, once I drop that back out, I can go ahead and I can take this off. Now I get to make decisions here. And I get to make decisions on each one of these. Okay, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take off that bottom piece right there. And when I get up into here, I don't want big, long, excessive internode lengths. I'm going to take this back to 2, and maybe I leave one of them a little bit longer than the other one. Okay, I'm going to come back into these finer branches on the interior, and I'm just going to shorten those a little bit. Okay, give yourself diversity. We hear this. Take it back to 2, take it back to 2, take it back to 2, take it back to 2. That is not a mandatory. This is an aesthetic decision, okay? And when you're thinking about this, you say, yeah, but you want the tightest possible internode. And it's like, yes, no, I totally get that, and we all want that, because that's what gives us a sense of scale. But how do you get there to that tightest possible internode? There's not one single path. There's a lot of different ways to get to that point where you get that really, really tight internode. And sometimes you have to build from other locations to be able to achieve that sort of tight internode over the course of time. Now, I might be able to sort of choke up in here as I get into the top to prune back to 2 and reduce the length of that, because I don't want this getting farther and farther away from the rest of the branch. You know, I don't want to let this continue to elongate. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give this some interesting movement. I'm going to bring that right back up. Okay? And once we position that here, now we start to recognize, here's my front, starting to see this sort of craggly nature here. Now I start to see, where do I need the distribution? I need this to be out into sun. I need this to come back. I need this to rotate over. This is what's setting up my trickle-down pairing and my trickle-down wire. Okay, because if you think, oh man, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to wire everything on this tree, it's actually counterproductive to the aging and the mochikomi that you've already accomplished. And we talk about this a lot. Broadleaf is not about wiring everything out into pads like coniferous bonsai. That's not what we're doing here. We're really making nuanced decisions to put the least amount of wire. We're not afraid to wire. We're definitely not afraid to wire. We're willing to completely transform and renovate this tree's design. But we've got to be doing so in a way that preserves and perpetuates the quality we've achieved in the branching to date, because that's how we build on the idea. That's how the concept grows. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. I'm just going to give myself enough wire to control one of my two forks independently on each of these pieces, because I'm not going to be wiring them all out. Okay, now I'm going to bring this over, bring this up. Go ahead and take this piece into its own position, and now we come back in. Let's go ahead and do away with those, and then I'm going to come back in here. I'm going to take it back to an alternating, take it back to an opposing, okay? And that's what gives me that little tuft right there. You see that little piece kind of finished out. Let me go ahead and keep working. Okay, and I'm going to build. I'm just going to start to stack on to the sort of this experience in terms of the style that we apply to everything else that we touch here. Okay, small little guy here. I'm going to avoid doing any damage to the buds. I'll take one of those two twigs. Move this right back to the interior, and I'm always on a young branch. I'm going to finish that piece facing up. Finish that piece facing up, okay? Take out the long internet. You say, don't you want that to develop? Sure, but I don't need that to be a big, strong branch. I don't need that to be the same thickness as everything else. I can go ahead and I can have smaller branches. That's also part of representing age in the broadleaf model, is having different size branches, different lengths, especially when we start to look at your branching hierarchy top to bottom on the tree can be very, very diverse in terms of that hierarchy, and the lower branches can be much shorter and the upper branches can be much longer, or vice versa. The lower branches can be long, the lower branches can go up. They can form some sub-trunks. They can do interesting things that start to give that kind of age and character. I love that. I love sort of experimenting and playing with that kind of character and quality, and giving that just that little touch of creativity and artistry that allows it to be something really special. Something really special. Just kind of moving that out of the way there. Something really unique, right? Pomegranates, the more craggly, the more contorted they are, as long as it's organized to give a sense of believable scale, you can't contort a pomegranate enough. You can't contort a pomegranate enough, okay? I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to take some of those lengths out. Okay, now I've got some pieces here. Again, I'm just going to piggyback. I'm going to keep this piece isolated. I've got another sort of little stagnant area on this back trunk that gives me a nice little combination here. I don't want to put a ton of wire in the visible areas or the visible spaces when I'm designing broadleaf trees. Okay, because if you put a ton of wire in the visible locations on your tree, now all of a sudden you start to see, and when I say visible locations, along the trunks and along the primary branches. So anytime I have structural wire out on a branching system, that means that's a closed system to any more wire, right? So as long as I have structural wire on this piece, every combination on this piece is going to happen on this piece, okay? So think about that so that you avoid putting a ton of wire. I don't want to wire this out to here and then this out to here. I want to close this system, close that system, close that system to avoid having excessive wire on my tree. Great. Love that. Love that nice, interesting, kind of fun. Have some fun. You know, people get so, oh, is it right? Is it not right? Is that okay? Can I do that? I hear a lot of people ask me, can I do that? It's like, I don't know, can you? Can you do that? Should you do that? Is that good? This is really, it's like, what's your vision? What's your vision for the tree? Is that your vision? Because if it's your vision, you can. If it's not your vision, then you can't. But I mean, you can't decide what you can or can't do. There are ways where we say, listen, are you moving the structural branches into a location where you're overriding the natural hierarchy, right? Where it originates is where it needs to exist, okay? That's definitely one where you can always constantly be saying, like, should I be doing that? Am I abiding by the natural growth habit and branching hierarchy? You should always be asking yourself that. Beyond that, right, is the material capable of representing the age I'm trying to give it? A lot of times you see people take nursery stock and contort it and twist it, and if you're going to develop it from there, that's awesome, but if that's your design, did the nursery stock give you the ability to represent the kind of age that your design is attempting to execute? Because if it doesn't have that age or that capacity, then it's always going to look contrived. It's always going to look really forced, right? Okay, cutting these pieces back, just sort of distributing radially to have a little bit. Okay, nice. Okay, now you start to see that back piece existing all the way back in here. Now, I recognize that this back piece occurs structurally higher than this piece here. And this piece used to be so massive, and we said we don't want that anymore. So if this piece occurs structurally higher than this, and we've intentionally shortened this, and it's not going to occupy a more dominant position, then I've got to raise this up just a smidge more to be clearly from your presented front, to be clearly above this piece that exists in front of it, and have those lines work together, right? I've got to work at that a little bit. Now, where the camera's sitting, we're just a little bit probably below where we would be in terms of where I'm sitting and the spacing that I'm seeing. I feel really good about it. We'll see if we can kind of tweak that in the end so that you can see what I'm talking about. But you always have to be thinking about those pieces of the puzzle. Okay. Now we come to this piece. Now we said, listen, this piece right here kind of has this a little bit of a pitfall, but there's another pitfall that's existing in this piece. I've got my opposing branches right here, and then I've got another set of opposing branches right here. Now, most of us say, hey, let's go ahead and cut this piece out. And I actually think that might be the move because we'll get a better transition of taper. However, if you think about it, keeping the two pieces of ramification up here, if they are of value, and taking off one of these two pieces would be the move if, again, these pieces were of value. Now, what you're seeing from the new front is that their orientation, their position in your transition of taper, not very valuable, okay? So I am going to go ahead and I'm going to cut that central piece out and cut it back to more usable, more important, and what we hope to be more interesting branching as we continue to rebuild this piece, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut my little V-notch out of this where I don't just go flat across, but I actually go down into the branch just above the shoulder. Okay, and one of them is going to have a much longer angle than the other so that it's an asymmetrical transition. There we go. Okay, let me just show you that so that you go ahead and bring me in tight, Jesus. Okay, take a look at that cut. Longer on the left, shorter on the right, shallow on the left, steeper on the right. Creates a little bit of asymmetry. Okay, I'm not going to clean that up necessarily. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to patch it. I'm going to see how the collar adapts to that cut. But also, let's just take a look at how that improved in my putty, if I can at all possible maintain the visibility of that crotch through my application of putty. Just a little bit of an indent or impression is all I'm really looking for, just so that I see that kind of transition. Let me show you that. There you go. Just a nice soft, subtle, and that's what we can expect as we see the callus roll. Now all of a sudden I have the ability to go ahead and correct that inverse swelling that was starting to form there, to go ahead and take off any of these knobs or nubbins that exist here, ba-boom. Get out of there, don't want it. Little spurs, off you go. And now we get to really kind of play with the contortion and the interest that exists inside of this piece. Okay, so I'm going to go back to a 12. I'm going to use 12. And when I start to look at this, you know, these branches are already pretty darn interesting here. I'm not sure that we can, not sure that we're going to benefit. Actually, yeah, this one's the least interesting. This one's got to come into space here, and this one's going to have to drop down. So let's go ahead and see what we can do. I am going to have to wire all three of them. I thought I might get away with it. I'm not going to get away with it today. Okay, and this one here is the least exciting of all of them. Okay, so I'm going to come up from the shoulder, always up, and then I'm going to drop that radical drop down, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to finish my last turn coming back up, and that allows me to go ahead and shorten some of these pieces in here to directionally prune to achieve a little bit more something of interest in there. I'm going to take off that piece right there, boom. Yeah, that feels good. That feels much more interesting, okay? I'm going to do the same thing here. So I'm going to come down once we came up out of the shoulder. I'm going to come down. And now let's go ahead and let's use this twist. I'm going to drop the kids off at school. That means I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to leave this one up, and let me see if I can get that up. Yep, get that up a little bit, drop the kids off at school. And now I come back down here and I got to get back up. Nice contortion there. Okay, now I'm going to take this back nice and tight. Nice and tight. Perfect, perfect. Okay, and that really nice and tight, when you've got the length that you want, you get those sort of aimed in a direction. That nice and tight is what creates the craggly angularity of the pomegranate. Okay, and that's important. It's important that we understand how the branching matures through the process of pruning and through that aesthetic utilization. Because if you're not leaving the kind of wood or tissue on the tree that gives you natural movement through the pruning process and improvement of your transition of taper and structure and et cetera, over the course of time, then you're missing the great tool. The great tool of time and the great tool of the tree's natural growth habit and behavior. These are the most powerful tools that we have to master. These are the most powerful tools of all. Okay, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take those off. I'm going to come back in here. I'm going to come back in there. Okay, just adding a little bit of nice interest to that piece there. Not too much, right? Not too much. Okay, so that takes us through the three minimal pieces. Now we get to dive in. Now we get to really sort of attack these bigger pieces. And when I start to look at these bigger pieces, okay, I'm trying to find where are these bigger pieces? Where do I have the ability to drop some pieces down into space? Where do I have the necessity or obligation to raise some pieces up into space? And where do I get to avoid wiring to take advantage? You know, when I have this piece up in here, when I have these pieces up in this location here, do I have to wire all of these? And the answer is if I don't have to, if they can carry the interest without me wiring them, that is how I build age on my design. That is how I build the mochikomi. Okay, so when I start to finish pruning, I start to recognize, gosh, I could just wire these two pieces and I'm set up for success probably. This one's going to need to move out of the way once we engage these two pieces. But let me go ahead and just set these two and see if I in fact can get away with just these two pieces carrying the bulk of the weight. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to cross over for structural support just because we are trying to get closer to closer on this pair. Okay. And I'm going to drop this down all the way down into here. Drop the kids off at school, okay, which means I'm leaving these pieces up top here. And then once I get all the way out here, now I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to turn this back up. Turn this back up. Awesome. Okay, now I'm going to shorten that. Shorten this here. Boom, boom. Okay, and if I'm going to do that there, now I've got to start to echo that through the other pieces that I've got here. How are we doing on time, Lonnie? Hour and 10 right now? Okay, I'm going to be finished. I'll be finished well before 2 hours. Just good. Okay, so there's that. All right, I'm going to go ahead. Now I get to shorten these pieces because I'm starting to feel a lot more of the sort of design coming together. Now I get to work on these two. Boom, boom. Those are my 2 odd ones out. I recognize I haven't finished this one. I've got to get this one out of the way. Come back in with your 12. Give me the gauge that allows me not only to move it, but also to continue to be able to deal with that phototropism, because even though we're creating an effect that would be fighting phototropism as a representation of age, this young tree, aged as a bonsai in dog years to be able to entertain this design, still relatively young in terms of its youth and vigor as a piece of material. Been out of the field for, let's see here, probably 2017, 18 was when I acquired these pieces. Been out of the field for a few years now. Okay, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take that back. All right, good. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring this one up above because I've got this one hanging down. If they're both trying to occupy that same space, now watch, because that allows me to go ahead and go down with this. And that's fun. Okay, I'm going to drop the kids off at school up top. Got another little transition here. Okay, starts out going up, and then we come down. Spread them. Okay, now that allows this into here, into here. Nice, I like that. And then we can go ahead. Let's compress. I'm going to take out the coarse tip here between the 2 fine ones. Bing, bing, off you go. Boom, boom, and boom. Okay, that feels really, really good. Okay, let me show you that. Starting to get some interest up in here, right? So you see this kind of rolling, craggly form starting to expand. Finished with that, all right? Let's keep moving. Let's move over to here. Okay, I've got this piece back in here, still very youthful and upright. I'm not going to try with something so small and underdeveloped, and you say, well, you cut it again, you keep cutting it. Okay, I don't want that to be the same kind of contorted branch. Now, I want to show that generational, bring me in tight here. I want to show that generational piece here, because this is that's so underdeveloped. To try and give that tremendously contorted movement doesn't make sense. But if I just zoom out slightly there, Lonnie, if I look at this piece here, now this has the ability to be contorted, and this certainly has the ability to be contorted. If I can contort those two, can I go ahead and prune back these pieces? I think so. So I'm going to hold these very, very tight. Really nice and tight. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do just a little bit of directional pruning. This is really where you see the change of direction here. Notice this continuation, very thick, a little bit coarse out there at the tip. Boom. Okay, now I've got that 90-degree angle there that I'm kind of manifesting through wire on the pieces that have a little bit more length and malleability. But if I can get to a point where I can prune in that character, gosh, that's forever invested and injected into the material, because now that angle never comes out of it. Now you got to be careful with that, because that angle can be counterproductive depending on where your front is and how you're trying to or attempting to show people your tree. Sometimes a 90-degree angle from the wrong perspective can create the circular shape. Sometimes that 90-degree angle, if you don't think about it, can be more challenging visually than it can be quality. So you just always have to be thinking about that position that you're trying to orient people from. That turn, great. Boom. Not too much control. Not too organized, not too much, okay? Let it breathe, let the design play a little bit, let the tree have a little bit of fun in this whole process. If you start to get too organized, you start wiring too much, you start kind of controlling things too much, that's when we lose the broadleaf character. That's when we lose the naturalness that we're trying to build on, right? Try to keep your decision making very objective and responsive, right? Because if you start to fall into, okay, now I wire here, now I wire here. I see this with students. I challenge my students to use less wire, and you'll see less wire used through the first portion of the tree. Now, the lowest branches are the easiest place to use less wire, unless all the branches are sagging, and then you got to wire everything. And you don't really have a choice if they're sagging and you got to wire everything, because the lower branches just might not be able to maintain the kind of strength that the upper branches. It would be an indication of a nutrient imbalance if that's happening. But when we start to say in the upper portion of the tree, that's where it starts to become, depending on how you think about it, that's where it either starts to become really challenging, or where there may be a necessity in a tree that is still, transitioning into that refinement level of branch build, and it doesn't have the strength distribution, because, when we start to talk about stepping into the different levels of refinement or the different levels of development or stages of development, you're also talking about, from primary to secondary, secondary to tertiary, differing degrees of energy distribution. Refinement is energy distribution, or even strength, top to bottom, interior to exterior, right? Apex of the tree has the same, sort of strength and distribution of strength as the lowest branches, and the interior branches have the same strength or distribution of strength as the exterior branches, okay? Okay, a little bit of coarseness here. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take that out. A little bit of coarseness here. I'm just going to tighten that up a little bit. Okay, now we're here. Okay, I'm going to see if I can save some of the progress that I've made on these finer pieces, but obviously these two bigger pieces, these are going to have to have a little bit of direction. So let's give these some direction. Okay, now you might be asking, aren't you taking out areas where there are threes? Certainly, and this tree has been fairly, I would say, fairly judiciously pruned to remove structural flaws. That's one of the things that when we do the sort of partial defoliation and pruning in the late spring, early summer, we're definitely looking at those areas where flaws have the capacity to continue to sort of perpetuate themselves. So if you're seeing any groups of threes, there's probably a reason that it's still being left there, and you may not be seeing whether it's actually, you might not be seeing it accurately. There have been one or two groups of threes that I've sort of corrected as I've been working through this currently, but I haven't seen many that needed attention. Take that piece out. Drop that piece down. Great. Yeah. Really starting to gain some nice character now. Really starting to gain some nice character. Nice. And I would say if it's unpredictable, if it looks like, oh, that's interesting. Now, some of you might be seeing this little space right here between these two. Definitely you know, the overlapping is of a slight challenge, but it's not circular necessarily. It's oblong in terms of its existence. And if I can just, I don't want them overlapping so that they have an inverse. I want to see that space just slightly so that we see those lines overlap, but we don't see a spherical form, right? The more that I rotate, the more sort of open and spherical it gets. My front is here where there's just a sliver of light in there, and I'm able to deal with that. I can accept that. Some people cannot. I feel comfortable with it, okay? All right, so now we're up here at the top. Now we're gonna have to really work. We're gonna have to set our intentions on not trying to control too much. I'm gonna take out some of the coarseness. I'm gonna reduce some of the length back to these junctions, and I still want to be pushing myself to not try to overly control and formalize what's happening up here. Okay, I'm gonna cut out some of the chunkiness at that tip. I've got a little bit of interior presence here. I've got this piece that's got a quadruple state of emergence. I'm going to take out that overly vigorous shoot there. I'm going to cut this shoot back to a nice fork there. That might actually ride right there, although I feel like I might have to redefine that. So when I look at this now, I've got this piece, but I see this one and this one as the odd one out, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and the only thing that would change that is if I felt like I better go ahead from my front and change the alignment of these two, which I don't really think so. I think this is interesting here. I do have a little traffic jam up top. Okay, and that maybe even helps my cause a little bit more. Go ahead and take that knuckle out. That one and that one. This piece, I think, is going to have to stay there. That actually helped my cause out quite a bit. So you see, kind of see how you work through it. Pruning and wiring have got to be done at the same time when we're working through broadleaf trees. I had to go through and prune the whole thing and then come back and wire. Can't do it. You can't do it. The pruning is empowering the wiring. It's improving the aesthetic. It's honing in on what's important. It allows you to identify what is the odd circumstantial piece that you need to go ahead and apply some sort of aesthetic change to, okay? All right, so I'm going to take my longer piece here, and I'm going to go down, which means in order to have control of this upper piece, I'm just going to choke up on that turn so that I get control of that. Okay, and now I can drop down because I choked up on that turn right here, right? I had the ability, instead of coming back over the shoulder of this, I had the ability to lunge in front of this here, right? But by choking up and coming over that shoulder, I can control the location of this with this wire, and that's what allows me to utilize less wire, okay? So what that means is I can come up now with this, and then I can hold and I can come down with this, and I can position that through the manipulation of this wire and have a tremendous amount of positive effect without having to necessarily add more artificial aesthetic to this particular piece at this particular junction of the tree, okay? And as we start to switch and shift direction here, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take back to right there. Oof, love it, love it. Super, super interesting, fun, really fun. Okay, let me go ahead and let me start to work in my space in here. I'm going to take these pieces that I want to stay a little more juvenile. Okay, I think this is probably going to need a little bit of love right here. Pretty coarse tip. Take off some of that coarseness. Take off that base. Yep, boom. Okay, take that piece back a little bit. Okay, so now we start to see. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to pair these two. Now I've got this one here, which I would love to not necessarily try and wire, but I don't think that I can get away with that. I think it's a little bit too complex. I've got this big knuckle up here at the top. I've got like 5 branches coming out of that. I'm just going to take that whole thing off. Just improve it. And these are the things that start to happen, and now all of a sudden I say, gosh, I don't necessarily need to wire that at all. Might have given myself the ability to bypass the necessity for wire there. but certainly those two need it. So let's go ahead and attack those. Now, notice as I work an area, I haven't finished this, but I'm now up in the upper apex here. Notice that the speed by which this kind of work occurs is decisiveness, okay? Decisiveness. I'm not sitting and moving the branch a bunch and looking at where I move it, right? I don't have to move it over and over again. I don't need to sit. And that's a learned skill, okay? When I was in Japan, I used to do that all the time, and it would make Mr. Kimura furious because it was so slow, you know? And obviously, you can't come into bonsai with the kind of proficiency that allows you to execute work on a really expedited timeline, but you can train yourself to not sit and mull over decisions over and over and over again. Being decisive and attacking design, right, from an objective perspective, that is a muscle that you have to exercise. That's a discipline. So if you see it, wire it, attack it, right? Because you're going to sit and hem and haw, and you might talk yourself out of it, but you're probably going to continue to come back to it, and you're probably going to end up wiring it anyways. All right, I got another group of 3 here. Let's work on the distance over here. So I know I want to shorten this now. Okay, I've got another group of 3. I've got a young shoot, and I've got a mature branch that has age. Notice here, I've got a really nice sort of stout, thick, shorter branch that's got some compact ramification. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take that off. And I might even start to look here and start to think about, should I go ahead and maybe even shorten here? But I've got enough interest out here. I've got enough going on. I've got enough changes of direction that I think I want to use that upward mobility that exists out there on the tip. I want to save this, and now I'm back in here to these 2 pieces. Now, this is where one of my groups of 3s are. Okay, now we recognize we took off these 2 pieces. We moved this branch into this space. When I start to look at, do I use this one or do I use this one? I think we have to think about, where is our distribution? I've got a branch that's coming into the same space there. I don't have a branch to occupy this front portion here, and that's where I'm going to use foliar distribution as my decision-making tool. Now watch this. I've got a little bit of a knuckle here, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take out my fork. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take out my spindly. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take that out. I ultimately just kind of directionally prune that area to go ahead and take care of itself. Now I could always wire this to the tip here, and if I felt like that was going to enhance things, then I got to do it. I do feel like it's a fairly simple branch, and we've simplified it even more by reducing the structural flaws. So if I'm going to have it blend in to the design that we're creating, I've got to probably give it a little bit of a repositioned aesthetic. I'm going to come up, boom. Okay. And I'm going to come here, and now I'm going to carry this tip up too, right here. Bang. Okay, that gives me more expression. Now watch. Now look at that. Just increases the complexity of that branch over there just a little bit, and that's all that I needed. That's all that I wanted, right? Even that little bit of enhanced quality, worth the exercise. Okay. Now finally I've got this piece in the back. Now the piece in the back has another, and I'm going to show it to you from the rear portion so that you can see what's happening here. Go ahead and bring me in, yeah. Okay, now notice I've got these opposing branches, I've got this really thick transition, and again, if these pieces are valuable up here, I need to take off either this one or this one of the 2 at this opposing perspective. But if I come down and I cut that crotch in, I can certainly ease the transition of taper, and I think that, again, in this circumstance, is the move to getting to the best tree over the course of time. So I'm going to cut that same notch out again. Voila. Small little piece of putty. Okay, and then my last wire on the redesign of the palm is going to be organizing these two branches off of this transition to guide their ability to contribute and fit in to this much more aged and contorted form of the broadleaf. And what a dramatic transformation in terms of the progression of age as well as hierarchical distribution, right? We've been working big time on trying to show the pruning process that allows us to further refine. I'm going to take these out and take that one back. But also in that pruning process, we've been trying to show within the same tree generational branching. We've been making decisions on aging the current mature branching. All of these things are progression. Bonsai is the art and science, right? The art of recreating nature in miniature, the science in horticulture of cultivating a tree in an unnatural and confined environment. That recipe, that duality, man, such an interesting, challenging conundrum, okay? Dramatic alteration. Okay, and there might be some lines in there where you're saying, I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know if I like that. Certainly I don't want this to be one big dome. So I see this giving the ability to create a little bit of that more informal billow. Now that I see it, I see that it adds value. Let's go ahead and get it out of there. Let's create one more shift. Let's see where I can go ahead and improve this branch down here. Let's give it one more shift of scale. This was a branch I thought I was going to get away with not wiring, that final move. Okay, you always come back and reassess your work. Final move allows us to enhance it one more layer. One more layer, one more little piece of detail, interest, etc. Okay. Yeah, yes, yes. Scale, different size. Love it. Love it. Okay, I don't know how I feel about this over here. I'm going to leave it right now. I'm going to leave it right now because we've made some dramatic changes. The degree to which the line improved, the base improved, and the dynamic of all of the trunks and the character improved, pretty dramatic. Pretty dramatic shift. A little bit of a ho-hum tree when we started, and all of a sudden now we start to see that base and that line and that character really providing some really, really solid design, flavor, interest, and age of the cultivated broadleaf tree, fruit-bearing tree, and how those branches start to take on that little bit more evolution of age, shape, form, and progression. Progression of the structural to secondary to tertiary transition of hierarchy, progression of representation of age and miniature in the broadleaf form. You know, I look at this tree and just sort of, prior to this restyling, oh, it was a boring tree. And now it's got life. Now it's got something interesting. And when I sat down, I knew I was going to have to make changes just to try and prepare for the stream. I was sort of looking at some of the different opportunities. And once I saw that we had such a better base, such a better line from over here, I recognized I had to make that transition. And it's tough. It's tough. Let me just pull this back and show you. I worked on this a lot. Like that's a big part of the tree. And yet this big part of the tree was really holding the tree back from being as good as it could be. Super objective decision to be made to go ahead and take that step into a higher quality execution of form in the broadleaf model. All right, give you one more once around here, just kind of showing the dynamic. Our front again right there. And let me go around one more time, okay? Now you see the tree leaning towards the new front. We see this evolution of branching and reduction of the distance and length in the back. Yeah, really something nice there. All right.